Dear participants of this seminar, dear guests, this is a seminar defending their rights, risking their lives. What can Sweden do to support those who dare? My name is Anna-Lena Laurén, and I'm the Moscow correspondent of Dagens Nyheter, the biggest daily newspaper in Sweden. And today we will discuss the situation of human rights, freedom of press, sexual minorities, and similar issues in Eastern Europe. And we'll start with could you please make a short introduction of yourself, our participants at the panel? We can start from the left. Yeah.
Good morning, my name is Anders Pettersson. I'm the Executive Director of Civil Rights Defenders.
Hi, my name is Karina Shiroki. I am a researcher at Utrikespolitiska institutet, the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and also representative of Ukrainian Youth in Sweden, civil society organization that is part of Forum Syd.
My name is Janine Alm Eriksson. I'm a member of Parliament and I'm in the Committee of External Affairs.
Good day, everybody. My name is Ognjen Radonjic. I represent Forum Syd.
Thank you very much. We'll start with a quick yes-no to a couple of questions. Are people or civil society more free in Eastern Europe today than they were 5 years ago? We will start from the right now. Yes or no?
Partly.
Partly.
Yes, it's not the same everywhere, but yes, more or less.
I would agree, yes. It's not the same everywhere. It depends a lot on the country. Yeah.
Same. Yeah. You can't generalize.
Next question. Has the freedom of press in this region increased during the past 5 years? Start from Anders. Yes or no? Yes or no?
No.
No.
Again, depends on the country, but rather situation became a little bit worse.
Yes, I think also it's worsening, so no if it's a yes or no.
I would agree as well.
No. Last question. Has the region been more or less tolerant towards minorities and different groups of civil society, for example, LGBTQ people? For this?
It's visibly less tolerant.
Yes, it's less.
Well, I would say that again, sorry to repeat, depends on the country. In some countries, improvements are seen. I would say in other countries, the situation got worse.
I would say it's worse, but I think it's higher on many agendas in the region.
Maybe we could start then with these problems. I think it's very interesting that all of you agree with the fact the problems of press freedom and the problems of minorities. How would you, for example, describe the situation of press freedom? Why did you reply no with regards to press freedom?
I was actually wanted to say freedoms perhaps increased, but the quality of the media decreased. And I would mean by this saying that the media space is muddier. There is more publications, especially internet media. There's a lot more publications, but the quality of it is very low. And it's very prone to propaganda, not only foreign, but also domestic. Prone to foreign influences, prone to business influences. So there is more publications, but trusting the quality of that information is doubtful.
Would you agree on this? Or do you have...
Yeah, I mean... you could say that fewer journalists are being killed than 5-10 years ago, but there is still a high degree of impunity. Many of the murders that have taken place in the past 5-10 years are still now being prosecuted.
In what countries, for example?
Well, in Russia, but also in the Ukraine and in some other countries.
Situation in Ukraine, you're Ukrainian yourself, right, as far as I understand. Their situation is very interesting because on the one hand it's seen as a cradle of democracy, as a country which has done huge progress during the past years. But on the other hand, there are serious setbacks as far as I understand the situation. How would you describe it?
Absolutely, you have a point. When it comes to the freedom of press in particular, so now what you can see it is that media that used to be quite free and critical towards the government and different actors in Ukrainian politics, so these media have been bought now, so on the last few months, couple of months, so this process is very visible now. That is something that we all need to watch out for, and unfortunately the scope is massive. So basically it is Medvedchuk, a close ally of Mr. Putin, who is very much engaged into this activity, unfortunately, and he himself purchased a few channels, and one of the largest ones, Inter, is now 80% belongs to him, basically. So that is something that makes many people cautious, and that makes me feel uncomfortable with these developments.
Well, Janine, you as a member of parliament, do you think that the European Union is doing the right thing in Ukraine in particular, but with the Eastern Partnership in general? Do you think that you are on the right track?
I think it's very important that we have the Eastern Partnership in very high value, and that we continue to work with our relations in a very and more close way, because I mean this was one thing that Sweden started and was an initiative too, and I think that this is one of the ways to actually keep on having the relations going, and also be able to discuss things like this, that it is important for us and for the EU that we have a free press, free media, and that we have the civil society that is free and able to criticize and come with good arguments.
Okay, when you say that the level of the media has become worse, what countries, for example, would you
I can take the Belarus, for example. The independent media in Belarus is still prosecuted in a very fine way. The journalists are not arrested anymore, but they are fined. They are arrested detained for 24 hours, and then hefty fines are imposed on them. Freelance journalism is still not allowed, but on the other hand, the internet space exploded with all kinds of internet publications with very dubious quality of it. The government now started imposing restrictions on the internet space as well, in particular for people to be able to comment on the news. And this is a very interesting concept of cracking or shrinking the media space.
Anders, you as a representative of civil rights defenders, do you think that the EU is doing the right thing in Eastern Europe, in Belarus, for example? Or because the EU is also very much criticized for not being hard enough?
Exactly, and I absolutely agree. I think they're disengaged. I think it's very difficult to track a clear policy. And I mean, the talks that the EU has had with Azerbaijan, for instance, has been focused on trade and commerce, which really upsets the network of human rights defenders in the region, who thinks that it lacks substance. So that's just one example where I think EU can do a lot more.
Well, if you look at the power perspective, one could say that there is a power competition in Eastern Europe between the EU on the one hand and Russia on the other hand right now. Do you agree with this perspective, and how does it affect the region?
I would disagree that it's right now. It's been there since '89 or probably even earlier. And that power struggle or geopolitical struggle is determining entire dynamics within each of the countries as well as in the region. That also power dynamic or power struggle is very often abused by local politicians in order to prop themselves or to diminish the competition. You can take example of Moldova here, where the most pro-European government in Moldova turned out to be a bunch of crooks that stole $1 billion from the National Bank.
Yeah, and people were extremely disappointed. I was there then, and yeah.
And the idea of Euro integrations that was put by Plahotnik, for example, caught the attention of the people, and it was abused, and it was used basically for internal struggles.
I wouldn't agree with that actually, and I would say that it's incorrect to say about the competition in the area, because what is competition in its essence? It is when different actors are aware that there is a competition, right? So they know that they need to compete with somebody else, and they have a strategy to do that. The EU doesn't have that. So if we look back to 2003 to this grounding document, Wider Europe, that Commission has published, which laid down the basis for Eastern Partnership idea. We can see that there is no competition. EU sees democratization and human rights development in Eastern Partnership region as a win-win situation. EU believes that, well, by securing democratic development of those countries, EU can protect its own interests, because those countries will be free, there won't be any persecutions, so they're interested in that. But as Russia sees it as a threat to the authoritarian rule of the system that has been established and successfully carried out throughout the decades now. So I think that Russia sees it as a competition, whereas I do not believe that EU sees it as a competition, because its actions are not showing that. And I think that the EU is largely guided by normative premises, such as development of human rights for own sake as well, making the neighborhood secure, prosperous. So the borders of the EU are secure in this way.
Anders, what is your comment?
Yeah, I think an important point also, if we're talking about the next generation of human rights defenders in this region, if you take Georgia and Ukraine, for instance, when the EU reallows Russia in the Parliamentary Association of the Council of Europe without any really concessions, that sends a negative signal to all the next generation of human rights defenders who are still there. And we are running the risk of them migrating to other countries instead of staying in the small piece of civil society which is left and building it from inside. So I think that sometimes it gets very political and very much focused on other things than the next generation and civil and political rights.
This is actually a very interesting question, Russia's role in the Council of Europe and the fact that they were returned their voting rights, at least partly. There's another perspective on this. There are people who think that we have to keep Russia in the Council of Europe because we have to give Russian citizens the possibility to appeal to the court in Strasbourg, and we have to give it's the only. I live in Russia myself, and I know it's the only way for them to get some sort of justice in many cases. But on the other hand, as you said, this result showed very much that Russia, after it was said that they would be returned their voting rights when they returned Crimea, and it hasn't happened, and now things are back to normal in a way. How do you, as a member of the Swedish Parliament, regard this issue?
Well, Sweden voted for this not to happen, and it still happened. So we're obviously in a minority there, because we think it's important that we show that what we said from the beginning is it's still viable and should be done before this was voted through. But we see this struggle very much. I was in Ukraine just a month ago or something, and the struggle between Russia's influence and the EU influence is very visible in all the levels of society, I think. And it's and I agree with you say. It's more like not so much of a competition for the EU. There, it's more like we want the country to be free. We want the press to be free. We want a strong civil society, and that's what we are supporting. And we are also supporting, of course, society strengthening and building from a lower level. So and we see trends there. That is very positive, which is, but also, of course, now with the snap election and everything, it's very difficult to see what will happen. But it's important to strengthen those parts of society that is supporting the free involvement.
Right.
And
if I may add up to that, so you brought up the question of the elections, and I think that connecting these two topics, readmission of Russia to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe is sending a very negative signal before Ukrainian parliamentary elections, because we have one group of people whom we call Euro-optimists, and there is also another group of people largely emerging or re-emerging from the old party of regions. So, and those old people from the party of region, they say like, well, you're optimists. You haven't managed anything. Look, you've been struggling on diplomatic arena for so many years, and yet Russia is readmitted. So what do you have to show? Europe is giving up on you. And these messages are largely resonating with the electorate. And I'm very afraid that this particular, I would say, unwise decision could lead to potential negative consequences, and not only in Ukraine, unfortunately.
Yeah. Did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, yes, just real quickly. I think the one upside is that Russian citizens are not denied access to the Court of Justice. I mean, that is one thing, but it also sends.
Well, yeah, but sorry. If the court carries on, if Russia is, because Russia was almost leaving the Council of Europe, or threatening to leave it, so yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think it's also sends a signal to other countries when it comes to Russia getting away with a lot of stuff, meddling I mean, waging 2 wars against COE members, also meddling in elections, sending agents to the UK to kill people. Those kind of things. I mean, other countries are watching, Turkey and even Ukraine. So I think it not only should the EU be aware of this, they should actually be very concerned about this.
Okay, do you think that the Council of Europe, or what do you think about the discussion about Russia's role in Council of Europe? The idea that it's better to have Russia inside the Council of Europe, and in order to influence there, instead of having it out on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that Russia has now learned that you can actually do what you want and nothing will happen to you.
I think they already know that they can do whatever they want and get away with it. We also have in Council of Europe several other countries that have quite dubious relationship with human rights or respect other countries' boundaries. We have Turkey that is occupying North Cyprus for 50 years. We have Azerbaijan also as part of the Council of Europe. So this discussion is also on the level of what is Council of Europe and what purpose that serves. Coming back to the question, and perhaps this is also related, coming back to the question if EU is doing the right thing in the region. I think the intentions of the EU are good. However, the actions are not always the pleasing ones. And that is also, again, structural problem probably of the EU. And you can take this from the example of Belarus, which is also to some extent related to the sanctions on Russia. For the past 15 years, EU went through several cycles with Belarus. Cycle of warming up, then something happens in the country, crackdown of civil society, then it is sanctions, then those sanctions are increasing, then eventually they realize sanctions are not really giving any result, then they start warming up, which again leads to another cycle of crackdown, and then on and on again. And this is literally 3 or 4 times that cycle repeated. Now we are in the upper side of it, that things are reapproaching. There is a lot of dialogue in between, dialogue that is involving real civil society, human rights defenders, journalists, not panning out to anything, but there is actual dialogue. That can stop in the parliamentary elections that are already scheduled for November. So what is the end goal of the EU is unclear here.
Yes.
Yeah, I think also in 2014, part of why Russia went into Ukraine and Donbass, and I mean, it was the relationship and the negotiations that Ukraine were having with the EU about this. So that in itself, I think, also scared the EU to some extent. And they ousted a president, and they have freer and fair elections. So in that sense, they are a bit freer. But at the same time, oppression when it comes to oligarchs on media and persecution of journalists is getting worse and worse, and has been since 2014.
I wanted to return to something which you mentioned, the disappointment with the EU, because when I travel in the region, I hear lots of disappointment with the EU, especially I think in Ukraine. During the last elections, people were extremely disappointed with the fact that the very painful sometimes reforms which had been made during Poroshenko, and which still are not enough according to the EU and the IMF, had been very hard on poor people, especially, for example, the gas prices. Is there a danger for a backlash?
Right. I would say that the thing about the gas prices, it had nothing to do with the EU. It was a demand of the International Monetary Fund to
but the way people see it, it's part of the whole integration with the West project.
But when we talk about the EU, there are also many reasons for people to be disillusioned in a way. First of all, reforms were painful, as you said. Some reforms were largely unpopular. For instance, inclusive reforms to include LGBT community more kind of in a legislative scope in such a way that their rights are protected on the workplace. That reform was not popular, but it was presented as a necessary step for further European integration, and people swallowed that, which is a good thing, because even those who were apologists of quote-unquote traditional values, so they voted for, knowing that that would bring Ukraine closer to Europe by association agreement. So I would say that this particular association agreement played an important role to kick some reforms in Ukraine. But at the same time, I see a huge disadvantage and probably lack of thinking from the side of the EU when EU let Ukraine get association agreement without fully complying with all of the conditionality, especially on the anti-corruption institutions. So in the final statement, when Ukraine was officially suggested to proceed with association agreement, there was one sentence, and I'm trying to quote, but very freely, something that, President Poroshenko promised that these institutions will be established soon. So, and I would say that in the context of Ukraine and anti-corruption institutions, institution, you should not take any word for granted, because that was it. The institutions are still not in place. Fully functioning checks and balance in that domain are not still in place and haven't not been given a free way before signing association agreement. Maybe we would have seen now a little bit stronger anti-corruption institutions.
Yeah. Please, Odin. Yeah.
If you allow me to be a little bit cynical here, I would say that this is primarily a marketing issue. The idea that reforms are done in the country just to get integrated with the West is a marketing issue. These reforms should be done for the better of the citizens of that country. And I can, over this experience, I can broaden to Balkans that went a little bit further in the integrations. All the reforms were done because the West or the EU is demanding this from us. Not because this is necessary or not because this is good for us, but because somebody from the outside is asking us. Then we can always blame this one from the outside if it fails or if it is hard. And this is a fundamental issue with it. This is also something that probably EU also should be working on, decoupling integrations and the reform, even though they are joint and coupled, but the reforms should be done for better functioning of the state, not for some geopolitical reason.
Do you see a problem, Janine, with the way the reforms are, in a way, marketed in the country?
Yes, of course, because that makes it lack legitimacy from the ruling people, and you can't, as a citizen, demand responsibility for what is happening. I mean, that is not just a case for the eastern countries of Balkan. We see that here too, that parties sometimes come down to saying, well, we have to do this because of the EU or something like that. So we are... it's much better to take responsibility and say that this is necessary for this and this and this. And it would be good if they did not just have the market things and the fuels in this thing, but also the human rights perspectives, of course, that better society for human rights, civil society and free press and media is better for us as a country and not worse.
With regard to the EU has had its share of problems during the past 5-6 years. We've had the migration crisis, and then there has been steady going on degradation with regards to freedom of press and an independent judicial system in both Poland and Hungary. And we have Brexit. How dangerous is it for the integration with the EU in your region, in Eastern Europe? The fact that the EU itself, as it seems to me, is a bit losing faith in itself. Do you feel it?
Well, compared to 5 years ago, I would say, and I think you raised a very good point when it comes to the marketing aspect. When we speak to our human rights defenders in the Western Balkans, and in the region, they look at EU, as I mentioned before, as what's in it for us. What kind of change will it bring? Because EU is not the change agent here. It's the next generation of human rights defenders. Those are the people who are going to lead their country toward a peaceful solution and hopefully integration. So I really like the point of actually disengaging the two issues. One being very political and very much based on trade and the core values of the EU, and the other one more on civil and political rights and true reform of civil society.
But if I may just add up, when we talk about association agreement, for instance, it was indeed so. Human rights and freedom of press, these were mentioned only marginally, and actually originally LGBT rights were not in the conditionality for the association agreement. It only came after the Venice Commission reported on some violations. So originally it was not foreseen there. And I would say that this dimension was the least pronounced in the association agreement, not only with Ukraine, but also Georgia and Moldova. And I think that, on the contrary, maybe that would have been a better idea to cope it better, to bring more fundamental freedoms, fundamental values into the association agreement, so to boost it, because we know that at least legally these countries comply with this conditionality. We can see that in Ukraine, although people do not share understanding that LGBT people have to be equally included into the workplace, people still say that, yes, we need to adjust our legislation to proceed further with European integration. And conditionality throughout the decades was the strongest push, the strongest impetus for all of the countries in Eastern Europe that wanted to join the EU. We know that it is the most powerful instrument, so why to abandon it now? I would say that we should be, on the contrary, more pronounced, more concrete on what we want, less fluffy, but like in concrete terms, not only legislative changes, not only change of constitution, if you like, but implementation and change in practices.
I wanted to return what you said about the fact that the leaders of these countries should themselves tell the people why we want this, and return to my question about the fact that the EU itself, in a way, is quite busy with other things now. Do you think it's a dangerous situation, that it could tilt in some other direction in several countries?
I think it's the slowing the process of reforms altogether in all countries. However, in some of the countries there is a momentum, like in Ukraine, for example, and even more recently in Armenia. This is the momentum that cannot be lost that easily, can be gambled away by the politicians, but it will sustain for at least for a couple of more years. And then again, coming back to this topic, EU integrations, Armenia is a very interesting case.
It is.
And we will see in the next couple of years whether they will be able to implement internal reforms and democratization without actually switching geopolitical course. This is the biggest example of this change.
Yeah.
And I see. I think just when Britain decided to do a Brexit, I think we were weakened and lost self-confidence, the EU. But now I think the trend is, because this has been, the debacle that is going on, and so the 27 member states that are still there are getting stronger together and more committed actually to stay together, because now you also see, even if the Brexit hasn't occurred yet, we still see what it probably can happen. And in the European elections that were just a month ago, we also see that the Green parties, for example, was strengthened on the behalf of the populists. So we are a stronger power in the European Parliament now, which is also, things can happen in different countries, and we still have to cooperate to see that we don't see more of that development. But I think that Europe showed that we are not ready to cave in for populists or a total decay of the union.
With regard to the reform process, there is one issue which Karina also already took up, which has turned out to be very sensitive in the EU candidate or to be candidate countries or countries wanting to become candidate countries, and this is the issue of sexual minorities and their rights. Well, this summer, not long ago, there was a peaceful gay pride parade in Kiev. It went peacefully, which hasn't always been the case. And in Tbilisi, they postponed it. I haven't checked the situation this morning, what's going on, but at least they postponed it for a couple of weeks. Is there any really change in this regard in Eastern Europe with regards to the rights of sexual minorities? Yes.
I would say there is. It's slow and it's painful for many of the activists themselves. If we look at 10, 15 years ago, take Balkans, the attempts for a pride parade were severely beaten down. I was there last year, and there were only 600 riot police there, and they cordoned off so the pride parade could actually take place. Last week there was a pride parade in Tirana. So I think the awareness of LGBT rights is much higher on the agenda, but that has also woken the far-right extremists. So it's a polarized issue, perhaps more than before, but at least it's on the agenda, and that's maybe the silver lining of the issue. But again, it takes a tremendous amount of time and effort.
What would you say?
It's probably the most polarizing issue in Eastern Europe. It's partly also driven by the Russian propaganda, or in general conservative propaganda, the notion of gay Europa, that any of these countries that are joining Europe are actually joining gay Europa, and this is something that they should avoid. It's also a very easy propaganda target, because it's difficult to diminish democracy as a concept, or freedom of press, or functional societies. But for the conservative societies as these are, the notion of LGBT rights is very polarizing. So it's a very easy topic also to polarize society.
Yeah, and also think of one problem is the fact that in especially ex-socialist countries, I think people are not used to the fact that certain groups in society have interest and that they actually are defending their interests. It's seen as separatism, more or less. Yeah, sorry. You were first, and then I'll. Yeah.
I think you raise a good point. Russia is really peddling the traditional values card, and that's being adopted by other countries. It's by origin a Russian invention in its modern form. But if we look at Viktor Orban, Salvini, there are other people of that nature.
They all love it. Yeah.
Exactly, and they peddle the same rhetoric, and it really polarizes the issue, and it creates the them and us. So it's been clearer than ever before. I think.
Yeah.
I just want to put things into the time frame perspective. It took a long time since Greenwich Village riots up to in the Western world to come to this point. Let's not forget that 30 years ago in Eastern Europe, being LGBT was a criminal offense. So we've came quite a long way. Not far enough though, but still fairly long way.
But yeah. Did you want to?
Well, the development of the rights of the LGBT movements and also women's rights, because we see that is also not always something that goes naturally. We still have to support those movements, of course, and the networks and the people working for more freedom for these groups. And that is one of the strong Swedish inputs in this region.
I think what you said. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to contribute on this topic about Kyiv and the Pride parade in Kyiv. So I should say that this year it's been seen as largely success only because the government managed to secure the place, only because the number of policemen and women was large enough to prevent those provocateurs to, really impact this movement. Because previous years we saw that this attempt to have Pride parades didn't succeed. Indeed, because they didn't have enough logistically support. I think that they learned their lesson, the police forces, they learned their lesson. And this year, they managed to mobilize people in such a way that actually it succeeded. But if you look at the footage, you'll see that there was a line of policemen on both sides of the street protecting the people who took part in this pride from those who stood on the sidewalk. So we cannot talk about so much freedom and tolerance, because to assure this experience or to secure this experience, you had to have hundreds of thousands of policemen and women on the streets. But about the anti-LGBT movement, and I would say that in this regard, it is very much connected to the anti-NGO sentiment in the region and the role of Russia, as you nicely brought it up. I think that Russia plays here a very important role, because, for instance, when these anti-LGBT legislations are being initiated or rhetorically brought up in political discourse in Eastern Partnership countries, you can see that it all happens half a year or a year before elections. The population is largely homophobic. Majority of people are not that tolerant towards sexual minorities. And this is a good kind of marketing instrument, again, right? To bring attention, to look at us, we are the family members, or like we're sharing family values, vote for us because we'll protect you from those corrupt norms, etc. So I would say it is used for political gains, and I wouldn't take whatever is being said and mentioned 1 year before elections for granted, because it has been used instrumentally. But you said absolutely right that it's not only Hungary but also Poland that listen and watch what Russia does, right? And this legislation, authoritarian legislation, so to say, illiberal legislation, it diffuses throughout the region. And readmitting Russia to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, again, shows in the region that this behavior is normal, keep on going.
Yeah, exactly.
Please, you were yeah.
Another thing to put into perspective, most of the national movements, anti-communist and anti-Soviet, were also extremely nationalist.
Exactly.
In Central Europe as well as in Eastern Europe. And this nationalism is also patriotism, it's also putting the conservatism up front. When it comes to these 6 countries, especially those that are under direct foreign attack, like Georgia or Moldova or Ukraine, this nationalism and patriotism is even more pronounced, and it's always targeting minorities, regardless what minorities those are. So that is also putting additional strain on the LGBT rights and gender rights as such.
With regard to this situation, we talked about the EU. Is the EU doing the right thing? But the question is also, is Sweden doing the right thing? Because Sweden likes to think of itself as a role model when it comes to democracy, human rights, freedom of press, and these values. But is Sweden doing the right thing? And what should it actually be doing if not? What do you think?
If I might, so Sweden indeed does a lot in this region, and particularly in Ukraine. And Syria is involved very actively in the region, helping civil society. But I think that, well, most of this assistance, official development assistance, bilateral, so usually it is given money from one state or one developmental agency in one state to the government of a recipient state. And quite often this money disappears or end up in the pockets of wrong people. And I think that by itself that could indirectly prompt or lead to a high level of corruption, something that we try to fight with the other hand when giving money to the corrupt elites or corrupt governments with the first hand. So, and I think that what Sweden could do, and not only Sweden for that matter, but also maybe the EU as such, it is maybe invest more resources into capacity building activities, investing resources and this financial kind of input into civil society organizations themselves, while educating those who take part in civil society, right? Investing money into some educational programs, let's say master studies with a specific focus on human rights and democratization. I think that that would have been something that would be much less likely to lead to higher level of corruption, but would rather invest these resources into the development of the civil society, and that's what we want eventually. And at the end, it's not the government, it's not politicians who oppose some authoritarian developments in the region. These are the people that take out to the streets and protest. And if we can support them, then this awareness will be growing. There will be a critical mass of people that wouldn't let the governments to slide down to authoritarian practices.
Anders,
I think Sweden, the Commission, and also the World Bank, they've done a fairly decent job over quite many years in terms of institution building, but they haven't tagged that to demanding accountability with states for their own people. So they tend to do it in a two-way street. So stronger focus for Sweden as well on demanding accountability in the institutions that we have.
Adding on to this, I think in any development cooperation project that the government or bilateral projects and relationship between governments, in order to demand accountability, or the easiest way to demand accountability would be involvement of local civil society. And this is probably what Sweden should be doing even more. It is happening in many of the places, but this is something that should be done more. Because this way you are at the same time developing civil society, giving recognition to civil society and assuring local ownership and local accountability. What is more important, what Sweden should be doing more, is also giving a political recognition to the human rights defenders, to the oppressed journalists and civil society in general. Because this puts them on somewhat evil footing with the government and with the duty bearers.
I have a second point, I think, which I absolutely agree with both of you. And the capacity building part, civil rights defenders, we work with over 200 actors around the world, and many in this region as well. It's very local, and building it from the local and up, that makes a difference. But our partners also have questions when foreign aid goes into law enforcement, the same law enforcement that are actually oppressing them. So yes, we want to reform law enforcement institutions in these countries, but we have to be very aware of their performance, and again demand accountability. Otherwise, we lose trust.
Do you think that there's danger also when Sweden and the EU goes in and finances, for example, NGOs and all sorts of different projects, that it is seen, and I know it is seen in many countries, they are blamed for trying to influence on the country, trying to meddle in the country's affair, and we have this Soros phobia, which is very spread in Eastern Europe right now. How can you tackle this sort of problem?
Working for a Swedish international implementer for many years, I would think that Sweden has the least of this reputation. United EU, for example, UK, United States especially, would have much more focus on this. Sweden, since this was never been seen as a geopolitical actor, and it was always seen as more driven by values, doesn't have this kind of reputation. However, the foreign funding is always carrying its own risk of over-dependency and less accountability to the citizens of civil society, to the citizens of the country. And this is something that is really on our side to deal with.
Yeah, and Swedish alternativists and far-right extremists are adopting that same narrative when it comes to Swedish organizations. So I think we're seeing that appearing here in Sweden as well. You know, the whole foreign funding, the nationalist pride, that kind of rhetoric is coming to Sweden as well. So.
I can just to say if we are doing the right thing or not. I mean, very much more would obviously need to be done to strengthen the situation for the civil rights movements in Eastern Europe. But we do not, for example, give money into state budgets in order for them to disappear completely. What we support projects with civil societies and networks and so on, strengthening civil society and democracy, because we also see that, I mean, democracy and everything that has to do with that, like freedom of press and things that we have talked about here, is very vital for it to work at all. So I think to support civil society as we are doing, and we have just put more money actually into the democracy fund, or what you could call it, in order to work with these questions more, is not money disappearing into pockets, but very much with these organizations. And of course, this is a challenge too, that we do not want to undermine the work that is done by saying that we support them in what they're doing. So so that is also a very difficult thing to keep in mind, and how to do it and where to do it.
I know you maybe don't like black and white questions, but I still would like you, because we are wrapping it up now, we have 4 more minutes. I would like you to name one country which has made which is now on the right track, you think, in Eastern Europe, and another country which worries you right now?
Well, I would say that the latest developments in Ukraine worry me. I would keep my eyes very much close to what is happening there. A country that makes me more optimistic is actually Georgia. If you compare its previous scores in the rights of LGBT community and NGOs, they have increased slightly, but still, and they are more stable than in other countries. In Ukraine, it's more turbulent. You can blame, of course, the ongoing war in the east of Ukraine, and also part of this country is occupied, so you can connect it to this factor. But unfortunately, it really seems that the development processes are not linear. There are ups and downs, and it is a roller coaster, you know. And unfortunately, when the old corrupt elites are coming back, and the party of region, the politicians from that party are one by one coming back to Ukraine, so it could end up not that nicely, I would say.
What about you?
Yeah, I was thinking a bigger perspective. We look at Freedom House, we look at Vidam from Gothenburg, and what they see as trends. We have to go back 30 years to see that more countries are moving toward illiberal democracies or electoral democracies or autocracies than in 30 years. And that's an extremely worrying trend. And against this backdrop, I actually had the same countries in mind. Ukraine, who actually toppled their president in 2014. They have elections. They actually have elections. They are freer and they're fair, but they have the yoke of the oligarchs, which is still there, and the corruption that comes with that. And I think that is extremely worrying, also with the annexation of part of the country. And again, Georgia, in the discussions that we're having with our network in the region, I think Georgia is one that stands out. I think Georgia is one of the countries where we could see that instead of civil society shrinking, there are opportunities to expand it. And that's what needs to happen. If we don't expand this space, it's going to go down the same route as in Chechnya, where Kadyrov said, we're going to close civil society. And if that happens, it's lost.
What about you?
Well, I think that we talk about here as Eastern Europe and the countries as they were one, and of course it's very different, and the changes are sometimes happening very fast. Like we see a good development in some country, and then very quickly it goes back.
But can you name 2 countries?
No, I don't want to name 2 countries, because I think it's very important that we keep track on what is happening on the whole and also on the different countries. But on the thing that you were asking for, also the political recognition of civil society, society. I know that when we have meetings between our governments or meetings with parliaments and so on, we always stress these questions, that it's very important that the civil society has their rights and that you support them and that they are a vital part of a free and natural democracy. So I just want to say that we are doing that also.
Ogden, you will have the last words. Can you name two countries?
I've been accused of being a pessimist, not accused, pinpointed of being a pessimist. So asking me which country is going in the right direction is a rather difficult question. But I would say that Armenia seems to maybe eventually will be on the right path. Yeah, I'm putting a disclaimer here just in case. But as it looks now, it seems to be on the right path. Country that is worrisome is Ukraine, not only because of its own internal struggles and the fatigue of the reforms, but even more because of the importance of it. Ukraine, as example, is the most important country in the region. And however Ukraine turns, the rest of the region may follow. The most intriguing case in the region is Moldova, with this odd pro-Russian, pro-European coalition just being formed. And this is something that we need to see how it will play out. But this is the most intriguing case.
Many thanks to the participants of the seminar. Many thanks to the audience.
Thank you.
And we'll follow the region closely. Thank you.